the sad eyes. Don't be discouraged, oh, I realize it's hard to take courage in worlds full of people. You can lose sight of it all, and the darkness inside you makes you feel so small.
You can be amazing, you can turn a phrase into a weapon or a drug. You could be the outcast or be the backlash of somebody's lack of love. But I wonder what could happen. I see your true colors shining through. I see your true colors, and that's why I love you. So don't be afraid to let them show. I wanna see you, just wanna see you. I wanna see you, I wanna see you be brave. Show me your smile.
Josef Aukee is a San Francisco-based poet, singer, musician, author, and marketing manager. He is mostly known for his spoken performances for the past 30 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as shows in Nashville at Bongo Java and Victor Victoria, San Diego at Winston's, New York at the Bowery Poetry Club, Chicago at the Green Mill, and Los Angeles at Highways Performance Space, Santa Monica. He has mostly been performing at venues such as Sausalito Yacht Club, jazz bars, wine bars, and wineries in recent years. He is the author of the poetry collections Town and Country, Where Bright Stripes Go, and Hill People. He recorded a collection, Afterbeat, and together with Giles Reaves, he recorded a live production of his poetry show, Industrial Strength. His work ranges from meditations and satirical commentary on contemporary urban life to the poetry of place. Josef often colors his live performances with vocalists and instrumentalists who provide dramatic voices and experimental musical backdrops using spare electronic sounds and pop and jazz styles. He lives in Sausalito, California. He is also the marketing manager for Golden Gate Performing Arts, aka San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus and the National LGBTQ Center for the Arts. He can be found on Instagram at Josef Aukee, that's JosefAukee, or his website, josefaukee.com. You can also hear a few of his recordings at reverbnation.com/Josef Aukee. His book, Town and Country, is available on Amazon.com.
Can you hear me now?
Hello there.
How's my light?
You look fantastic, featured artist. How are you?
My COVID hair is here. Yeah.
Good to see your face. It's been, boy, oh boy, I guess like 10, 11 years since I've seen you. I met you via Joshua in San Francisco. I do not remember how or why. I'm assuming alcohol was involved and that possibly we were at, I don't know, a spoken word night somewhere. What do you think?
I believe the first time you met him is actually when he came to as our first featured reader when we started poetry readings at the Depot in Mill Valley. This was shortly after the publication of Town and Country, and we started carrying it at the bookstore there. And yeah, as I said, he was our very first featured poet.
That's right. I do remember you recalling that recently. Do you recall that night, Joseph?
I do. I absolutely. I don't remember you specifically being in the audience at the Depot, but
yeah. I managed the Depot at that time. So,
okay, that's right.
Yeah, so poetry had been done there before, and Joshua, many of us were up in NorCal that were friends of Joshua's, and we really felt he needed to join us up there. And because he was so involved in poetry, it just seemed like, you got to be up here. And then, yeah, that's what Joshua just said.
Yeah, perfect. I've been doing multiple shows here since about 1999 or 2000 in Sausalito. But no, I've been a little off the typical grid for poets in the Bay Area in the fact that I did get my master's at San Francisco State University in poetry, but I hadn't followed the full academic track, so to speak, of the poet gets the master's or what PhD and goes to teach. I really tried to take my work anyway, and others who have performed with me, out to venues where people actually already go, rather than a study hall at a university. So that's kind of how that sort of came about. My very first show in San Francisco was at a little place called the White Room with the Blue Glow, which is now known as the Knock Knock Club. It was the first water bar on the West Coast. And I had a keyboard friend who happened to be in town from Nashville on his honeymoon and played literally a kiddie keyboard for me from the audience. And I dragged in this exotic Russian woman off the street to read with me a few pieces and just went for it. It was called a self-peeling orange. And it was a crazy way to start, but I actually just did my 30th anniversary reading there just this last year or so.
Okay. And like any true poet, that's a brilliant story that you would take a creative writing class in order to come up with. Like, well, I gave this thing and a guy from Nashville and a play keyboard and an exotic Russian woman I didn't know. Like, that's fantastic. Now, speaking of places where you have performed in the past 30 years, Winston's in San Diego. I used to live a block away from there. Went there all the time. How did you come upon Winston's?
Well, it was through Joshua and our other friend there, whose name's going to escape me.
Chris Vanoy.
Chris Vanoy.
Who actually was just nominated a Beat Poet Laureate of America. But we could talk about that another time. In fact, I'd love to feature him at some point. But that is actually the very first place that Joseph and I ever met.
That's correct.
He came down, Chris invited him down as a featured poet, because we used to do that about once a month. We'd have somebody come down or come in from wherever. And before I ever moved up here, before, you know, like this was a thing. And ironically or interestingly, this didn't come about until I think he and I had met up here at the back of the No Name over many drinks and cigarettes, that it came up like, wait a minute, I know you. It's like, you were at Winston's. You were the featured reader like 6 months ago through Chris. And he's like, holy, yes. So he's actually, the running joke is he's my oldest friend in the Bay Area, even before I moved to the Bay Area.
Yeah, that was a super fun event. I consider myself still an honorary member of the San Diego Drunk Poets Society. So
That name I do recall. I think you mentioned that at some point, Joshua.
Oh yes, DPS. That was every Monday night at Winston's. It was fantastic, and that's how I met Chris and so many people. And
for those who don't know Winston's, it's really a rock and roll club, kind of it's kind of the Haight Street of San Diego down there, and so that was pretty fun to do. And it's always been something. I come from rock and roll business in Nashville, actually, so I was used to being in clubs like that, so it wasn't uncomfortable at all.
It was a fantastic venue. Unfortunately, about 4 or 5 years ago, they shut down the DPS, and Chris has since taken it elsewhere. But yeah, it was a fantastic. I mean, you've been there, you know. It was a fantastic venue for poetry. You know, you get on a good night, you'd have 150 people in there, and you know, beautiful lighting and a stage, and you know, great sound, and it was definitely a place to shine.
Yeah, there are some other artists that I've reached out to who have performed at Winston's. I don't know if you recall Al Howard and the K23 Orchestra. Yeah, but he hasn't responded to me. He's busy with his own production company now. So he's really evolved. And then you also, it seems that Joseph, you and I share some cities in common. So San Diego is what I call home. And then the Bay Area is where I moved after that. And now I'm in the New York City area. So you have been in New York with your poetry. You performed at the Bowery Poetry Club. I
have. Well, I started out, and I know you've talked to Julie Mellon, the violinist who works with me, but I grew up outside Detroit. And so I was raised and reared Detroit boy, and then I moved to Nashville to go to college, where I worked in the record business for about 5, 6, 7 years. And then with a short stint to New York way back then for a rock and roll job that fell through, but I wandered up around the New York area for a while, and then back to Nashville, and then and then I moved to San Diego for a year before coming to the Bay Area in the late 80s.
So equally, we have in common the bouncing around. And Nashville, my until a few years back, we had a family reunion every other year in Tennessee at Edgar Evans State Park, which is right between Nashville and Cookeville. And it's one of the longest running static things in my life were these family reunions. So, and every time we went, after I was old enough to drink, we would drive the 30 minutes to Nashville just for a change of pace, get out of the woods and experience some nightlife. Love Nashville. Anybody I think that is artistically inclined, especially musically, would enjoy that. It's a little mecca, tiny little musical mecca.
Oh, yeah.
So you've bounced around, had quite a few cultural experiences. So if you could share with us where you were born and like what you recall of growing up, where you grew up, and how that influenced you as an artist.
Oh, okay. Well, I grew up in Wayne, outside of Detroit, about 10 miles. And it was, I guess, sort of suburban living, but it was gritty Detroit suburban living, down the road from the Ford plant, and lived on the Rouge River, which is the famous river estuary there. And so, I mean, I was raised in the arts too. We had to learn piano when we were in fourth grade, and then you could pick whatever instrument you wanted in fifth grade. And I chose the E-flat alto horn for some strange reason. Well, I wanted trumpet, but they wanted me to play trombone, and I said, no, I'll try this, which is the instrument you try before you move on to French horn, which I then picked up in 6th, 7th grade. And along the way, I was, classic singing in the Lutheran church and singing in the choirs at school and acting in the plays and putting on shows like a good Finnish boy, And so I'd say it influenced me part by, I did get out to nature in a sense that every summer I would go canoeing in Canada, or in my teens, I backpacked in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and all those sorts of things for a city kid, that I was privileged to do, that I made money bussing tables or whatever I had to do to get to do that in the summers. So it influenced me both in an industrial way, because a lot of my work is about city living and the sounds of industry, and a lot of those pieces of what communities are like in an urban area. So I'd say that was a big influence there before my trek to the South, which was a cultural shock. Moving to Nashville. And, I remember one of my first teachers in college, I said, are you going to speak in that accent the whole semester? I mean, in terms of my writing, I didn't realize till I was in my 20s that I had already been writing, and I actually thought everyone else was too. I actually was about to move to California when I dragged out some poems and read them for a group of people in Nashville. And they were like, well, when did you do that? Well, I was keeping a journal at night, and I just assumed everyone else did that. So I had a record of thoughts, feelings. I mean, I had done a few lyrics for songs in Nashville, but never thought that seriously about what I had already been doing in my journals since, I was in a summer camp in Michigan. I found notes where I had written a poem, sitting at a lake. So that's kind of how that sort of happened. And
so,
then, go ahead. Well, and I just said, I got out and read those poems. And meanwhile, when I was thinking about going to California, I packaged up 10 or 20 of them and sent them to San Francisco State University, and they accepted me in the master's program right away. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about, being a good Finnish boy. And I know that you, for a number of years, had been doing a Finnish cultural excursion get together. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and how that, like, your role in it and how that, influenced what you were writing or whatever.
Yeah, well, I did write specifically for all the North American Finns get together every year. What's called FinFest. Well, it's every 2 years, I think. And so I ended up performing at FinFest in places like Sault Ste. Marie in Canada, and in Duluth, Minnesota, and wherever they would throw it. Basically where the Finns gather, which is basically the Midwest and Seattle, where they primarily have them. They actually had one in San Diego as well. But I did write a little bit about the culture of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which I've spent a lot of time in over the years. So it's about the landscapes of Lake Superior and being in the woods, and a lot of family time with sometimes up to 90 people taking saunas and hanging out at the lake. So I have many pieces that revolve around that sort of Northwoods sort of lifestyle. And there's a certain, well, sisu is the Finnish word that's not translatable in English, but it's sort of an inner power, or chutzpah, maybe would be the closest I can think of. So there's a bit of that, I think, behind the influence on some of my work.
So interestingly, again, more similarities. Would you say that your changing perspective as you moved around the country and were immersed in different cultures was a direct influence in not only what you wrote, but the need to write, or was that just an innate thing?
Well, I figured out that I was already a writer and I just hadn't really practiced it, which when I went to the San Francisco State poetry program, I wanted to study the other poets, and I think I mentioned a few of them to you, the early American mid-century modernists, as well as classics like Wordsworth and Keats and all that great stuff. And I wanted to formalize and actually write in traditional forms so I could learn how to break the rules, because I was just freewheeling it at that point. I was more influenced at that point by, I mean, I had read poetry, of course, in high school or whatever, but I was more influenced by Joni Mitchell and Bruce Cockburn at that point. And that's what I was reading for poetry, and Bob Dylan and those sorts of things. But I liked the formal work I did. I actually studied with Frances Mays, who ended up writing Under the Tuscan Sun. I don't know if you're familiar with. Myung Mi Kim and a couple of other great Bay Area poets. Really one-on-one, it was an amazing experience. So yes, culturally, from Midwest culture to, then I was in the entertainment business in Nashville, which was crazy and wild and wonderful, and hanging out with rock bands and bands and rock and roll clubs, as well as working with big country stars. And there's a few humorous poems I do about that, in terms of talking about those people and the culture.
So perhaps you can keep some of those poems in your mental Rolodex for a couple minutes later.
Yeah.
Unlike you and Joshua, who you both have been doing poetry for a long time, I took a poetry appreciation class in high school, and it opened floodgates. Part of what opened those floodgates of creative writing was actually another class, which was, this was high school. This was a psychology class. And for one quarter, we had to journal our dreams. We had to create a dream log. And so I was writing poetry, and I was waking up in the middle of the night every night, journaling about these dreams, because it was just such a, I don't know how to describe that period of my life, but there was a lot coming out, a lot happening. And having the hormones, I think, to back those up, to need to make something come out, I think was part of it. But I ended up writing, I don't know, something like somewhere between 75 and 100 poems in that period of time. And then I realized that as I kept writing, these were actually songs. Initially, they were just poems, but then they became songs. And this is before I learned to sing or play any instruments. So later, I just had all this work ready for me to put into music. But you're saying that this was happening as a part of just your everyday life from a very young age, right?
That's true. Yeah. I had thought about, I learned music early on, of course, and I thought I might more likely be a Broadway writer or a songwriter before I got into the, so to speak, management side of the music business.
And then, like to, sorry, please.
Nope, it's all you.
I was just going to ask if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing now and influences now, and because you do, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of it is about urban living, city living, the sights, the sounds, the industry, etc. And since you've moved to the Bay Area, you become, especially in the last year or two, highly involved with San Francisco Gay Men's Choir, in a production role while continuing to write and perform, etc. But how have you? Was it a seamless transition into that for you, or was it something that you specifically wanted to target? Just talk a little bit about how that came to
You work
be.
with the chorus now?
Yes, and how it largely impacts the overall artist that is Joseph, and what you, how and where and when you perform now.
Right. Well, I did want to bring myself back around. I've been in and out of the entertainment business as they paid the bills, so to speak. But part of it was to give back to the community, and a lot of my early writing was, during a great explosion of fun in the Castro. I'll not shy away from that. Simultaneously, I was going to grad school. I was hanging out in the Castro and working at magazines and waiting tables and all these various things, that were all feeding what I was writing at the time. So I think coming to the chorus, though, was part giving back to the community a bit, and also just to be in the creative space of that. We actually bought a beautiful new building on Valencia Street that's become the National LGBTQ Center for the Arts. So it's also the collaboration part of this is what's been really important and made me think a little bit more, because I'm an artist who, as a poet, you get to work fairly independently, and except when I collaborate with musicians and bring a show together, that's for live performance. So it has all of those elements that, I think connect really well with how I think about creating art. I had worked, though, in other small theaters in San Francisco and with arts organizations like Intersection for the Arts. And we used to do crazy performance art with the Lab, that when it was on Divisadero, and then in the Mission. So I had been around that world for quite some time. Yeah.
Is the Bay Area the longest you've been in one place?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you really feel home in that community?
I did the first day I moved into the Lower Haight. Yeah. Well, it was a bit rough in the late 80s in the Lower Haight.
Mm.
I mean, it was the skinhead period and crack, that was blocks away.
Wow.
So it was pretty crazy.
I don't want this interview to go by without touching on some poetry. I do want to know everything about you, but I want to get some poetry out there too. I absolutely fell in love with Wallace Stevens' Of Modern Poetry. So I was hoping you could read that.
Yeah, I thought that was the most appropriate for today, actually.
Yeah, could you read that for us?
I do, I have it. I have to take my glasses off to read, it's weird. Of Modern Poetry. The poem of the mind in the act of finding what will suffice. It has not always had to find. The scene was set. It repeated what was in the script. Then the theater was changed to something else. Its past was souvenir. It has to be living to learn the speech of the place. It has to face the men of the time and to meet the women of the time. It has to think about war, and it has to find what will suffice. It has to construct a new stage. It has to be on that stage. And like an insatiable actor, slowly and with meditation, speak words that in the ear, in the delicatest ear of the mind, repeat exactly that which it wants to hear at the sound, of which an invisible audience listens, not to the play, but to itself, expressed, an emotion as of two people, as of two. Emotions becoming one. The actor is a metaphysician in the dark, twanging an instrument, twanging a wiry string that gives sounds passing through sudden righteousnesses, wholly containing the mind, below which it cannot descend, beyond which it will, upon which it has no will to rise. It must be the finding of a satisfaction, and may be of a man skating, a woman dancing, a woman combing, the poem of the act of the mind.
So good.
Yeah, I love that stuff.
Mm. But that's not your own. So
That's right.
if you could, I would love to hear New Silence, and if you could give us kind of a backstory of how this came to be.
Yeah, well, in the Great Sequester, I have that poem, which is kind of funny, but I just have had a little more time to contemplate, and I've actually been enjoying it, oddly, realizing I didn't have to do all of these activities that I was up to, and this just came out of like the thought of 6 weeks in what I call a new quiet, a new silence, where it is a different way to confront your ideas, yourself, your craft, your writing, and all of those pieces. That's kind of where this comes from for me. But it's called A New Silence. A consequence of enforced quiet, invasion of songs filled with rebellious youth and heralded ambiance of now. I didn't speak of anything, only heard the news of poets and guitars. A provoked inquisition worms a way forward. This is a reconfigured garden. I gave no hint of transgressions. Coolness descends at the best part of the day. A meditated walkabout extends, dissonant curves and gravel on the path, flowers claimed as purple and yellow. I like rocks I haven't named. Feet settle on the uneven terrain. A rhythm is recoiled, mound of cacophony and spools, meant for the other me. I take on water. The ship is worthy. This will be the tide that brings it home. Thanks.
Powerful.
I have a quick comment question. I know we've touched on it briefly before. And one of the things I've always known about you for the last 12 years or whatever that we've been friends is you read. It's a constant. Don't know that I've ever seen you do a piece by rote, meaning that you're constantly going back to the written word, and often as you're before whatever perhaps. So what's that?
You froze.
Sorry,
Very good question.
Everything just froze for me.
Yeah. I'm not frozen.
So is that by design or choice? Is it because you don't?
I'll tell you the story. I did my very first reading all by rote, like an hour show. It was like doing a play for me. And what I tried to stop doing, because I was also doing theatrical pieces, which I think is a different art form. And I now find that how I write is also my sort of musical score to go by. And I often riff off them as well, and not even sticking to my own words. So I have become a little dependent on the paper and not been memorizing them. Plus I keep writing these complicated things I can't remember. So, I mean, that's part of it. But I think I am using it as a score, and my readings, I do intentionally have paper. Often I'm adding musicians, and it gives me cues, musical cues for them as well. But I would love to be able to memorize them all, but I change them up and play with them. And I think it's just a matter of discipline. I guess I could memorize more. So
often when I've seen you and seen your notations, even there's like, this is where so-and-so will begin. So I guess the question was more of a matter of, or if it's just, as you said, like an orchestration and set notation, as it were, so that you can reference it and then riff from it and go back to it in the moment, as you often do.
It is. And you're seeing me often with brand new pieces I had written just a week before or something, so I hadn't really committed to memory like that. I guess I think of it, a different thing as being an actor and memorizing a script. Well, I don't stick to the script, and I change the order of things. And I mean, not of individual pieces, but I don't have like just an act like Jerry Seinfeld that he just repeats like a stand-up comedian would repeat over and over. That's a different form for me.
So would you say then that you're, I mean, I've seen you, you riff and go, it's not a repeat performance. Like even when I hear you read the same pieces that I've heard you read over and over again, almost every single time I get something else. And even though your cadence is often the same, your emphasis changes. And is that just a flow in the moment of reading the crowd, or what a particular musician that you might be performing that piece does? How does that work for you? Is it a conscious process, or?
Yes, I reinterpret. Actually, especially when I have different collection of musicians. You know, if I have keyboards and violin and percussion, it's a different feel for me than if I just had a stand-up bass or if I'm just solo. Absolutely.
Okay.
But I do like to revisit pieces and rework them in that sense, and maybe how they flow. I've enjoyed doing solo readings recently because I realize I can let the production of a band get in the way sometimes. So that's something I have to be very careful about. Well, you bring up an interesting point about performance versus poems, I think, are for reading, which is why I want to get another book out. I have many, many pieces I don't read in public because they don't read as well live as they are on the page, or how they appear on the page, on the breaths and punctuation and all those pieces that you get from reading a book.
That was actually going to be a question that I know that when I write, I typically, like, I have a cadence I've developed, it's my own. And if I read it to someone, it's read in the same cadence that it popped into my head, like a rhythm, right? Mm-hmm. Even regardless of the punctuation and all of that. On page, it's one thing, but I was just wondering, do you, as you're creating, as you're writing, do you have a very specific, like annotation cadence pattern in your head that you're following, either intentionally or unintentionally, or do you go back and reinterpret that after the words are down on paper?
No, I believe it comes out in the actual act of writing, and the act of, it's kind of an idea that a phrase or an idea have a sound, and that I'm just finding the words to express them. And so I think it is in the act of writing that's built. And that the magic of how that happens, I can't explain. Otherwise, I'd be a millionaire. No. But and I do rework pieces. So yeah, I'll go back and realize that if I'm stumbling on a line when I'm rehearsing, I know that something's wrong with the poem. So I fix it, or I fix it live on the spot.
So I really would like to know how the quarantine and COVID-19 has affected you and your community.
I think COVID's been very interesting because I have very intense calls with the people I work with at the chorus and with my friends, and I can see it affecting people in wildly different ways. Some people are lonely, distressed, distraught. I'm strangely happy not to have my 5 million activities I'm usually involved in, and being gone from 8 in the morning to 11 at night and still trying to have a writing life. So it's affected me, though, in terms of great wonder about what comes next, while also, like with the chorus, we're grabbing onto the opportunity to do new creations via Zoom or different sorts of things like that. And I've had time to look back at some books I forgot I had and kind of dig in. And I think I mentioned, like, dig into my archives and put a new collection together and put some new pieces together. So I'm sort of inspired by the new silence, so to speak, that I get to have during this. And I'm fortunate to be able to work. Yeah.
Thank you so much for participating. We'd love to have you again. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you so much. This has been a real treat.
Yeah, it's great to see you again and participate.